Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to today's Centurion Research Solutions webinar on how decisions impact your win probability. I am your host, Rich Thielen, General Manager here at Centurion. I appreciate everyone joining us for what will be an information-packed session. A little bit of background on Centurion. We track 20,000 plus federal government opportunities across multiple vertical markets and support all four of these major industry challenges. We provide leading-edge business intelligence with our BI Now product that enables you to find more federal opportunities earlier. We offer actionable insight through custom research and analysis and pipeline development. Our Opportunity Assessment Now tool enables you to make fact-based bid, no-bid decisions and manage the health of your new business pipeline. Finally, we offer training and coaching to improve your business development process. Together, these services were created with one thing in mind, helping you, our clients, win business. This is the fifth in our Government Contractor Knowledge webinar series to be conducted by Mike Lisagor, Centurion's government business development subject matter expert. Mike founded CelerityWorks in 1999 and has been helping companies accelerate their revenue growth for decades. He has coached over 250 contractor executives, BD professionals, and program managers. We are recording today's event. An on-demand copy, as well as a copy of the slides, will be available tomorrow on Centurion's website. Finally, in consideration of your busy schedules, we will be continuing this discussion at our company LinkedIn profile right after the conclusion of today's webinar. So without further ado, Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Rich, and the several hundred of you who have joined us today. This morning I'm going to concentrate on the knowledge aspect of the 6 key business growth tactics. I'll cover many of the questions from the registration forms and will be also happy to respond via email or at your LinkedIn group after today's presentation. It's ironic to me that one of the most important aspects of a company's business growth success usually gets so little attention. In my experience, too many bid decisions are made with little or no in-depth analysis. So today I'd like to talk about decision-making in general, an effective government contractor bid decision process, and finally, several of the key questions that you should explore when deciding whether to respond to a request for proposal. Most of my comments are relevant to all kinds of procurements, including task orders. Decision-making is the process of sufficiently reducing uncertainty and doubt about alternatives to allow a reasonable choice to be made from among them. As we all know, it can be rational or emotional or both. We're all making decisions all the time. Just coming to a conclusion with me and myself can be challenging, so it's no wonder that making decisions that involve several stakeholders can be trying. And quite often, managers seek near-term path of least resistance, which is to avoid the pain of entertaining different or opposing views and the extra time it takes to gather all the relevant information necessary to make an informed decision. Which isn't to say that there isn't a place for instinct or gut feeling, but you'll be much more successful if you rely on intuition as a result of the consideration of the alternatives rather than in lieu of it. Jim Nightingale, author of Think Smart, Act Smart, states that, quote, "We simply decide without thinking much about the decision process," end quote. In a controlled environment such as a classroom, instructors encourage students to weigh pros and cons before making a decision. However, in the real world, there's so many decisions to be made that most of the time you trust your instincts to make them. The problem is when this methodology becomes the rule, even for the more significant decisions. Here are the 2 most common approaches to bid, no-bid decision making. First, shown here, is authoritarianism. The manager makes the decision based on the knowledge she can gather. Let's say this takes 10 minutes. Then it will probably take her 30 minutes to explain the decision to the group and another 30 minutes to gain their acceptance by overcoming their objections. The alternative is to have a group that shares ideas and analysis and agree on the final bid decision. Studies show that the group often has values, feelings, and reactions quite different from those the manager supposes they have, and no one knows these preferences and experiences as well as the group itself. So organizations that embrace group decision-making on more important matters like whether to pursue a strategic bid or not typically have a higher success rate and don't have to spend nearly as much time explaining and convincing. It takes at least twice as much time to follow the tired old authoritarian approach. However, it's also important for the organization to recognize that there's a time for groupthink and a time for decisive action. In other words, sometimes you just have to make a decision. To know the difference is one of the most critical roles of a leader. Bid decision making is the same process where the alternatives are to bid or not to bid. A too common weakness of government business development efforts is the lack of an institutionalized bid decision process. An opportunity bid decision will ideally be first made at the time operations or engineering makes a commitment to take over the leadership of a bid. It may be revisited during a capture review, but it must be done upon request for proposal, RFP, release. In simplistic terms, there are usually 4 possible outcomes of a bid decision meeting. The first, and for many companies the most difficult, is to say no to the bid. I've had clients tell me one of my major contributions was to just help them say no. There are many reasons for this reluctance to kill a bid, including a fear of going against a strong individual's attachment to the bid, not wanting to have to admit that any investment up to this point was wasted, an unfounded confidence in your competitiveness, and pressure to fill the new business pipeline. In other words, make the numbers look good. I'll discuss this in much more detail in a pipeline management webinar in the near future. I know some leaders whose response to a fear of making the wrong decision is to delay it. This can be especially frustrating to a proposal team that's waiting to start a proposal as they watch the proposal clock due date rapidly approaching. It's even more damaging when it occurs after RFP release. Maybe somebody should pass a law that all executives must work on at least one proposal so they understand the impact their bid decisions have on the staff they rely on to do the work. However, delaying a decision can provide time for additional thought and extended analysis, and new alternatives to be recognized or created. For instance, with further meetings with some companies and the customer, you may decide not to prime one job but to subcontract another. Contingent decisions are decisions that have been made but put on hold until some condition is met. For instance, the identification of a project manager or a key teammate to include in the proposal, or the resolution with the government contracting officer about a potential conflict of interest, or the determination as to whether the client has a favored contractor and it isn't you. Once a bid decision is made, there are numerous actions to be carried out. I discussed many of these in last month's Proposal Best Practices webinar, which is available for viewing on the Centurion website in the webinar section under the Products menu. One key decision is whether to team, and if so, whether to prime or subcontract. Please see the recording or slides from my Teaming Subcontracting Best Practices webinar for that discussion. Illustrated here is a simplified bid decision process that unfortunately only exists in a parallel fringe universe with infinite resources and schedule. However, here on our Earth, you should at least try to apply these decision-making steps to your larger, more strategic bids. As you follow these 5 steps, remember that in a typical decision-making situation, you'll probably find yourself moving back and forth between the steps. In deference to your busy schedules, I decided not to delve into each step in laborious detail. On the other hand, even though this is a free webinar, I still feel compelled to give you more information than you paid for. So, at the beginning of the decision-making meeting or meetings, make sure there is a well-defined agenda with time limits for each topic. This is especially important to derail anyone in your company who likes never-ending meetings. A DC phenomena that drove my wife and me to move to an island on the West Coast. Get the facts, but remember that you cannot get all the facts. Get as many facts as possible about a decision within the limits of the time imposed on you and your ability to process them. But again, remember that virtually every decision must be made in partial ignorance. Make sure to consult those who will be affected by and who will have to implement your decision. Make a list of all the possible choices you have, including the choice of doing nothing. Not choosing is in itself a decision, and sometimes the decision to do nothing is at least better than the alternatives, so it should always be consciously included in the decision-making process. Also be sure to think about not just identifying available alternatives, but creating alternatives that don't yet exist. I can think of several times that I convinced a client to consider and adopt a different acquisition strategy more favorable to my company. Of course, this is more difficult in our current procurement world of task order contracts. Evaluate your relative strength or win probability for each bid factor. I'll cover these in a few slides. Remember that the bid you might like the best, or that will be the best of all possible worlds, might be the obvious choice, but not winnable in the real world because of too much cost, time, or a lack of acceptance by others. I don't have enough fingers to count the times I've seen this happen in small businesses. I once had a CEO who took a vacation to Taiwan and came back determined to do business there. Unfortunately, we barely had the back office staff to do the payroll and contracts, much less deal with all the aspects of international contracting. The company lost a few $100,000 chasing this business, and the impact on our domestic business growth was measurable. I, on the other hand, appreciated being able to see the amazing National Museum in Taipei. From the beginning, it's vitally important to know who in your organization is the final bid decision-making authority. 2 years ago, I did a proposal process assessment for a well-known contractor and discovered that on 2 important but losing proposals, the decision maker changed during the proposal process. This caused enormous confusion among the staff and costly redirection. One other important item, often overlooked in implementation, is that when explaining the decision to those involved in carrying it out or those who will be affected by it, don't just list the projected benefits. Frankly, explain the risks and the drawbacks involved and tell why you believe the proposed benefits outweigh the negatives. Proposal implementers are much more willing to support decisions when they understand the risks and believe that they are being treated with honesty and like adults. Implementation and measurement, or in simpler terms, status, is 2 or more webinar topics. So just one key point. Once a bid decision is made, it's crucial that the decision is communicated to all the stakeholders in a timely manner. That's one of the main problems with hallway bid decisions. Nothing is documented, and each person walks away with a different idea of what was decided. Okay. For the remainder of today's presentation, I'm going to discuss several bid decision criteria. Each of these factors should be carefully and as much as possible unemotionally weighed. Centurion's Opportunity Assessment Now product supports this type of decision making. We'll demonstrate this exciting new solution after an overall discussion of the application of analytics to determining win probability at the next webinar on May 15th. At the least, a simple Word or Excel table will enable you to carefully quantify whether to bid an opportunity, and if so, what weaknesses have to be corrected. But while free, this more manual method is much less accurate than the Opportunity Assessment Now tool. Because of slide limitations, I can't show this entire bid matrix. Here are the first 2 of 10 or more criteria. But on each of the next slides, I'm going to discuss a single row of the matrix and share some lessons learned. Each of these factors should be carefully and as much as possible unemotionally weighed, and then the total score taken into consideration when making the bid decision. There isn't time today to cover each of the positive, neutral, and negative explanations in each of the columns on this bid matrix. However, you'll be able to download these slides for further consideration after the webinar. The first criteria here deals with compatibility or fit of an opportunity with your strategic plan envelope, your competencies, and your market. The strategic envelope is the services and products and target agencies you'll concentrate on and the ones you'll say no to. So the first question that should be considered is if the bid being evaluated is even in your company's strategic envelope. This is one of those areas that can be very difficult to bring up in a bid decision meeting, especially if the organization's leader wants to bid it. I've worked at companies and consulted for companies that the executives who stifled honest discussions. These companies rarely have high win probabilities and usually fail to develop a key set of core competencies and clients necessary to sustain continued growth. How well your company meets the technical and functional requirements of an opportunity is, of course, one of the most obvious bid criteria. If you think the customer's evaluation criteria will be the lowest cost technically acceptable, then a neutral technical capability might be sufficient. However, a best value or even higher technical weighting might require a stronger technical capability. This slide illustrates how this concept can drive your bid decision and strategy. It also applies to some of the other bid criteria like key personnel and past performance. I have a client who recently submitted a proposal where the customer actually stated in the request for proposal that if a bidder had no relevant past performance, they would be deemed acceptable. Clearly, lowest price technically acceptable was the overriding evaluation criteria. How to compete in the current lowest price technically acceptable acquisitions that many agencies are now embracing is of critical importance, and one of the three major opportunity assessment areas of opportunity assessment now. Unfortunately, more often than not, while the government specifies a best value procurement and industry believes it, the agency ends up still awarding to the lowest credible cost bidder, unless a higher value bidder's price is within an acceptable variance. So it is vitally important to engage in some dialogue with the customer and research previous agency buying patterns. This type of BI Now opportunity insight will inform your pricing and technical solution strategy. This third strategy only works if your company has an outstanding solution for the RFP statement of work and can communicate this solution in an effective manner in a proposal. It doesn't count if the customer can't evaluate it. So this highest technical fit criteria score means you have it and believe you can write about it. There are at least two main elements of past performance. One is whether your company or team has the required number of project citations that are similar in work type and scope. The second is the quality of performance on these contracts. Here are 5 questions to consider when rating this bid decision criteria. First, do you have the number of projects that are similar in work type and scope to the current request for proposal? The more the stretch, the lower the win probability, and therefore the bid decision score. Is your former client willing to provide a positive performance review, or is the past performance in the government's performance database positive? If the past performance was negative, was corrective action taken to fix the problem that you would be able to present in the proposal to mitigate the less than outstanding performance? If so, then include it. If not, then try to find another project citation to use instead, or perhaps no bid. Is there time to notify former clients that you've included them as past performance references? They usually appreciate a short phone call or email. And finally, is there time to obtain current contact information for the new contracting officer or other point of contact to include in your project summary write-up? Evaluators only have so much time to chase down contact information, so why not do this job for them? Key personnel, especially the project manager, are often one of the top evaluation criteria in a services RFP. It's even more important on bids that require oral presentations, such as GSA Alliance task orders. I've had the experience of winning competitive bids at orals after having been number 2 or 3 in the technical evaluation. This is especially important if you are a small company going up against larger companies that have the ability and resources to write outstanding proposals. In other words, a few solid key personnel who are liked by the client can seize the day. The ideal key personnel are known, trusted, and respected by the customer. This means you've introduced them prior to the RFP being released, or they are already known from prior work you have performed at this agency, or you've hired them from an incumbent contractor or on a contingent basis. Having highly qualified key personnel is important, although I've seen companies win bids with key personnel who have relatively weak resumes, but were really liked by the client, which of course speaks to the importance of establishing strong relationships with the customer during the capture phase of the competition. No matter how desired or qualified your key personnel are, they must be willing to be bid in the proposal and available upon award. In the 80s and 90s, some services contractors got a well-deserved reputation for the unethical practice of bait and switching. They bid John, knowing he wouldn't be available, and so delivered Mary upon award. Fortunately, I've seen less of this in the past decade, but there are also occasions where the time between proposal submittal and the government evaluation and award is so protracted that some of the people you bid are no longer available. In that case, anything goes. Because of their skills and seniority, key personnel often have salaries at a higher end of their pay range. The staffing mix or balance you bid is a critical decision on cost-sensitive bids as opposed to best value or technical bids. Another matter to consider is the balance between bidding more junior staff and seasoned experts. There is a risk here of negatively impacting your past performance. 2 years ago, I wrote the project management guide and associated online training material for a major government corporation. I also recently developed 2 acquisition risk case studies for GSA FedSim. The corporate training consisted of 5 one-hour self-directed modules and was just an introduction to the material, and the 2 GSA case studies only covered a few of numerous acquisition challenges. The point of all this is that I could talk a whole day, probably with no one left on the webinar, about project execution or delivery risk. And too few companies evaluate these risks when making a bid decision. So even if they win, they risk losing money and piling up poor past performance. Here are 6 project execution risks that should be discussed as part of a bid decision. I'll cover each of these and more during a post-award project delivery webinar later this year. The main point is to evaluate the probability that your company will be able to perform at the bid price, and also important, that this is a client you want to work for. Like most companies, some agencies are easier to work for than others, and each agency has a full range of managers, the really good ones, the adequate ones, and some really terrible ones who should have never been promoted. I try to stay away from this last category unless absolutely necessary. It's important to make honest assessment of how strong your company's relationship is with the target client. It doesn't mean you might not proceed with a bid, but it does give an indication of how much ground you will have to cover in the proposal and allows you to consider actions that might still be taken to improve client rapport, for instance, through teaming with a strong incumbent. Assessing the profitability of bids warrants more discussion than can be covered in a short webinar, but in my experience, few companies have a clear understanding of the kind of work they're targeting. Does your company's cost structure support low-margin service tasks? Or do you have higher-end enterprise architecture consulting that demands higher rates? Take the time to develop sufficient marketing strategy and pricing guidelines to ensure a thorough analysis of the profitability and risk of each bid. It's impossible to assess your company's cost competitiveness on a specific bid without having competitive pricing information and agency award history. Centurion clients use BI Now to support each of these activities. The first step is to determine the most likely pricing competitive range based on market research factors and an estimate of the government's most likely should cost estimate. One major advantage of using Centurion's BI Now solution is its extensive historical labor pricing information. This slide provides a very simple overview of a possible competitive price assessment based on the information described in the previous slide. By understanding where your company falls in the competitive range as it relates to the customer's probable should cost, you can determine if you should even bid the job. And if so, what changes or actions you might need to take to your capture strategy, including your staffing mix, to achieve your target price. There are, of course, much more sophisticated pricing tools and methodologies, but for many smaller contractors, even a simple cost-competitive exercise like this can make a big difference. I discussed competitive analysis in the business development process webinar. We'll also explore it from an analytical perspective in the next webinar on May 15th. There are, of course, many services bids that only require the contractor to provide rates for several labor categories. You might decide that spending time analyzing the competition in this case is not a valuable use of your company's time. However, it is very important bid consideration on most procurements and should weigh heavily in the final decision. There are executives who make the decision to respond to an RFP without ever questioning whether the company has resources and time to put together a winning or even compliant proposal. Organizations need to prioritize their bids and make sure valuable proposal resources are applied to the most important bids. This will encourage reasonable win probability expectations and fewer losing proposals. It will also improve proposal team attitude. This is a factor that should not be ignored. In the land of the $100 million task order, in the often difficult to talk to government buyer, it has become more difficult to assess prime contractor credibility. When a $20 million small business can win a $400 million contract, and bid decision common sense has gotten thrown out the door. But rather than being accused of shrinking from this controversy, I'll take a stab at it. The better your reputation in the eyes of the client, the higher the chances that you'll be considered a credible prime contractor. Some companies, like SAIC, Booz Allen, or IBM, can pass the prime credibility gate easier than a mid-tier or small company looking to penetrate a new agency. There are various teaming strategies that I discussed in the teaming webinar that have been successfully applied to overcome a prime perception weakness. But I believe a lack of prime credibility should be factored into bid decisions more often than it is. This is a view of the last or bottom section of a bid decision matrix. Each of the criteria I just walked through should be scored, and the total entered here. Then a group discussion should be held about whether the probability of winning is acceptable. As you can see, this type of analysis can be performed in a spreadsheet or Word document. But a more complex tool, such as Opportunity Assessment Now, will result in a much more accurate decision. However, for some companies, even this type of free decision template will be a tremendous step forward. I hope you can join Centurion's Managing Director of Analytics, Dr. Doug Ingram, on Tuesday, May 15th, when he'll discuss how analytics can dramatically improve your win probability assessment, save bid and proposal dollars, and increase your win rate. Doug's talk will then be followed by a demonstration of the OEM tool. Feel free to email one of the individuals shown on this slide for further information. A copy of the slides will be made available at the web address listed here, and a recording of today's session will be uploaded by tomorrow. I'll be sending you an email with these web addresses as well as a link to register for the next webinar. Based on today's attendance, I'd again recommend registering early to guarantee your virtual seat. I'll leave this slide up for the next 5 minutes. And until May 15th, I thank you for your attention and happy hunting.
Mike, thank you very much. What a great presentation. Really appreciate all the hard work, and thank you to all of the folks that attended the webinar today. As Mike mentioned, he'll leave this slide up. Feel free to join us on at the company LinkedIn site, which is listed there, and provide any feedback or questions to the folks listed on the contacts as well. Thank you again, and we'll see everybody May 15th.